Hello, my name is Naten, and I want to tell you a story that happened in my family a few years ago. My family always lived close to each other. I grew up living with my cousins, uncles, and aunts. They were all very nice, except for my uncle. He was my mother's brother. Since he was a teenager, he caused problems. He got involved with members of gang and ended up being arrested. My mother had 4 brothers, and she was the chasuble. I remember that in my childhood we had to spend time at my grandmother's house where my problematic uncle lived, and another one who was a very exemplary guy worked. And he studied a lot. He was the complete opposite of his brother. My mother's other brothers were already married and had children and lived far away. Living at my grandmother's house, I saw how he was a bad guy. He always arrived late and drunk. He kept bothering his mother wanting money. He woke up everyone in the house, and he did that to really disturb me. I saw several fights between him and my other uncle because of the way he treated my grandmother, and they really fought. They broke the house. It was very bad to live those months there with them. Once I saw him attacking my mother and my grandmother too, but I was about 10 years at the time, and I couldn't do anything. It was undoubtedly one of the most horrible things I've ever seen. A man hating a woman. Who intervened on the day was my other aunt, who had arrived from work and caught the scene happening. After that we moved and life went on. We went to visit my grandmother sometimes, but he was always there disturbing the house and her life. My grandmother had such a sad face. My mother was so angry about this situation. I remember well that I visited her house when I was 14 years old, alone for the first time. As soon as I got there, I already smelled the cigarette he smoked in the house. He was extremely irritating if he bothered with everything we did there in that house. His name was Jorge, and as soon as he saw me there, he started teasing me. He didn't like anyone visiting my grandmother, and she, poor thing, couldn't do anything. I talked to her about him and asked why she let him bother her like that. She said she had no choice. She had already asked him to leave, and he simply wouldn't go. He told her that he would wait for her to die to keep the house and the money he thinks she has saved. Really, my uncle is a monster. And everything was already bad, and my uncle made a point of making everything worse when he became addicted to crack. I heard from my mother that he was in that state. I went to visit my grandmother, and as soon as I entered the house through the living room, I already smelled that horrible smell of that drug. Damn. He kept using it locked in his room. My grandmother was scared and locked herself in her room. I was very worried because I was afraid for her. Until a few weeks passed and he started selling the things he had in his room. It didn't take long to start selling things in the house too. My grandmother moved to my mother's house afraid of him. That other uncle of mine too I had left because I had got a very good job in another state. It didn't take long for us to receive the news that my uncle had been killed. They found him at home with 5 shots in the face, all in his face. The neighbors said it was because of debt account with drug dealers. The house was pretty much destroyed, and with almost nothing inside. He had sold almost everything. They held his wake with a closed coffin, and there was almost no one at his funeral. That scene was very sad. My grandmother then returned home, did a super renovation, and bought everything new. Now her nightmare of years was over, and she was super happy. It had been years since I had seen my grandmother like this. I know it sounds strange, but my grandmother was feeling lighter after my uncle's death. He made her life hell, but in the second week that he had passed away, my grandmother called my mother at dawn. She had called the police because they started to hear noises in the house, and when the police arrived there was nothing and nobody. My mother was curious, and I, who was 16 years old, offered to sleep at my grandmother's house to keep her company. The house was very different. I stayed in the old room of my uncle who had moved. The very first night, I woke up at dawn smelling the cigarette that my uncle smoked. I found it very strange. I got out of bed and turned on the lights in the house. I went to see the clock. It was 2:30 in the morning. The smell came from his room, which was closed. I found that very scary, and I went to wake up my grandmother so that she could see it with me. When she arrived in front of his room, the smoke continued until we plucked up the courage to open it, and there was nothing. The smoke and the smell disappeared. I asked my grandmother what that was, and she said it was Jorge, that he hadn't left, and that she had already seen him around the house at night. It froze my spine. I had just witnessed a supernatural scene, and my grandmother told me about it. I tried to sleep the rest of the night, but I couldn't. I kept that in my head until close to dawn. I smelled smoke from crack, similar to the smell that remained the house in the last days of his life. But again I went to look and there was nothing there. At night I started to hear noises. It sounded like footsteps, punches on the walls, the smell of cigarettes, the smell of drink. There were so many situations in such a short time that I was going crazy. For me, what made me run out of that house and never come back, it was one night around 3 a.m. I got up to drink water and saw him in the kitchen. It was my uncle with the clothes he used to wear, but his face was horrible. I was disfigured with the shots he had taken. When I saw the scene, I froze. He then screamed and came running after me, and I locked myself in the bathroom. He then kept banging hard on the door that I was holding until my grandmother opened the door and asked me what was going on. After that, I took my things and went back to my house. I told my mother what had happened, and she believed and helped my grandmother to sell the house. It didn't take long. It was sold because it was put below the value it was worth. My grandmother moved, and my uncle Jorge seems to have stayed in that place. Nowadays, the house is an Airbnb and lives empty. And I know that there is life after death because I saw my uncle. I felt his knock on the door, and that was traumatizing. This is today's video. If you liked it, please subscribe.